in thinking about the welfare levels in zoos, we might think, for instance, does this particular species have a higher welfare in a zoo than in the wild? What was observed during the pandemic was that many animals seemed to miss the contact with humans.
One of the worries is there's no regulations around who gets to use the word sanctuary and who doesn't. And so, there are institutions that call themselves sanctuaries that really just breed a lot of young animals for visitors to come and pat for photos.
But then if you have something like a school trip to the zoo where a kid for the first time sees all these animals, then that can often lead to someone becoming much more of an animal activist, or at least someone who cares about animals. And that can't be taken for granted.
You can see the wonder that they feel when this happens, when they get close to animals. My hope, perhaps my naive optimism, is that humans genuinely have a kind of a psychological desire to do well by animals and to connect with them.
Good morning, Heather. Good morning, Walter. How are you?
Hey, I'm very well, thank you.
Very good.
Good. Well, it's wonderful to get the chance to talk to you both again. You're both repeat guests. So Heather, we spoke back on episode 54, and Walter, you've been on twice now on episodes 48 and 158. So it's great to get you both together now, particularly because you're married. So it's wonderful to have guests getting married and coming back on as a couple. So congratulations. I know it's been a while now, but congratulations.
Thank you.
And I guess another congratulations is because of your new book, What Are Zoos For? And I thought that's what we'd focus this conversation on, because I've already drilled you about our basic sentientism questions about what's real, what matters, who matters, and how to make a better world. So we can zero this in on your new book, which I just finished. It's fascinating. But before we get onto that, for the listeners and viewers who haven't watched our previous episodes yet, how would you best introduce yourselves and who you are and what you do before we get into the book?
Yeah, so I'm Heather Browning. I'm a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Southampton, and I work mainly on questions around animal welfare and animal sentience. So I'm interested in the sort of the philosophy of science about how do we study what's happening inside the minds of animals? How do we find out what the world is like for them? And then what are some of the ethical implications of what we find out?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And Walter?
Yeah, I'm Walter White, and I study the diversity of minds. That involves animals as well as neurodiversity. Obviously, in humans, we see a diversity of how the world is experienced, but in animals, that's even more grand. And then potentially the speculative thought of how that might look in AI systems. And then obviously, if there's this diversity of minds, a lot of philosophical theories that are based on the assumption that minds are essentially the same with mild differences might give us very different answers if you look at this more broad question. And our zoo book is one instance of that, where I think about, how should zoos run given how different animals are from us, and how can we take a non-anthropocentric perspective to take them into account.
Yeah, thank you. And that was one of the fascinating things about your book. Obviously, it's called What Are Zoos For? But almost a more important theme running through that is who are zoos for? And it's a fascinating and often quite polarizing topic, because as you ask people about zoos, there it is, beautiful. I love the cover too. As you ask people about zoos, you'll get a dazzling variety of sometimes very strong opinions. And some of those will be, sadly, this is probably quite close to the average human. Some of those will be that zoos are places of entertainment. They may see the animals that live within them as objects of fascination. And I use the word object deliberately because, can feel like that, right? They're something to be used for entertainment. There may be glimmers of compassion around the edges, but mostly it's fascination and interest and entertainment for the people going. And they will see zoos in a very positive light as a result of that, because maybe they have a slightly restrictive view. There are others, many particularly within the animal advocacy movement, who will see zoos as inherently exploitative, as something that ultimately should be abolished. And, they're exploitative in the same way as maybe animal agriculture is. So, yeah, you'll have dazzling variety of sometimes very powerful views, and your book, I think, is a bold sort of entry into that topic. But what led you to write the book, and how would you best sort of introduce its themes and what it's trying to do?
Yeah, so we originally approached to write the book because it's actually part of a series. So there is a series that's been put out by Bristol University Press that's sort of titled "What Is It For?" And so they cover all sorts of different, I guess, institutions and concepts. What are they for? And so we were approached because of my expertise in zoos. So part of my background is before I was a philosopher, I was a zookeeper. I worked in zoos for quite a lot of years as a zookeeper and as an animal welfare officer. And so, yeah, I guess sort of the overlap in being able to understand both the industry from the inside and the philosophical concepts around the ethics of it. It was a reason that, we were approached to write this. And then because Walter and I have worked together on a lot of sort of questions in ethics and animal minds, then, we decided that we would like to write this book together so that we could approach some of these ideas. Taking these sort of views, because like you said, there's these opposing views often that come up. There's, I guess, a lot of books written by philosophers are typically pretty anti-zoo. They're very much, about animal liberation. And then you get these sort of more pro-zoo views, perhaps coming from more within the industry about, everything wonderful they think zoos do for conservation and that, that justifies whatever might happen inside a zoo. And so I guess we wanted to provide maybe a more balanced perspective that sort of looked at, what comes in between these, and particularly from the point of view of the animals and not just from the human ethics.
Yeah, thank you. And the challenge of these different perspectives, I think, runs through the book quite richly. But maybe a good place to start would be to set out what you describe as the different pillars of, I guess, human interest in zoos. Why do zoos, how do they justify their existence? And, what are they for from a human perspective, historically and today? And also, has that shifted over time?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely been a shift over time. So, I mean, there's the four pillars that people talk about as being the justifications for zoos are entertainment, conservation, education, and research. And what we've seen, is that there's, I guess, zoos have picked up some of these over time that, certainly back in the beginning, they were very much places of entertainment. Their sort of original proto-zoos were owned by rich and powerful people, rulers and other kind of aristocracy, in order to demonstrate their power. And sometimes they would, collect these animals to show that they could and maybe open it to the public as a display of their wealth and generosity. But there was nothing there about the animals. And over time, some of these other kinds of, I guess, goals have been picked up, using them to educate and conservation purposes and to learn more about animals. But that's all relatively recent. And so I think this history and this the entertainment and the kind of, I guess, the domination of animals that came up in the history is one of the things that leads people to be very concerned about what zoos do.
Yeah. And I had a fascinating conversation about a slice of that history with Bill Wassick and Monica Murphy, centered around their book, which was zeroing in on a particular period of American history. And those sorts of stories about zoos and menageries and so on were a sort of really interesting example of some of the tensions there. Yeah. So, and how would you describe the portfolio of zoos as they are today? Because there's as you make clear in the book, there's a lot of varieties of different zoos, some better and some worse. How would you describe that landscape of what's out there?
I mean, there's a great diversity of zoos, and we want to make very clear in the book that we're not just defending all zoos as they currently exist. There are best practice guidances of joining zoo organizations, and they have increasing welfare standards. So if you join them, it's not like that's a fixed level. You can just continue practice as it is right now. Those welfare standards are increasing further and further, and they should increase, obviously. And what we want to say is that if you think about an ideal zoo, given practical considerations, of course, given budget as well. So it's not just create a paradise necessarily, but can we make welfare a priority of zoos? And under those conditions, I think that's quite achievable. And then we wanted to give a kind of analysis of when we think about the best zoos that really prioritize animal welfare, do we even need to justify them? And one of the ideas we defend in the book is that, well, even the question of asking, can zoos be justified? They often assume that there is harm taking place. But in these zoos, we postulate them, that really prioritize animal welfare, that assumption can be questioned, in which case you don't have to ask anymore whether they can be justified, because they're already providing then good lives for the animals.
Yeah. And I think there's probably a reasonably uncontentious portfolio of zoos where many people would see them as bad for the welfare and of the animals themselves, and from the perspectives of the animals themselves, and would join you in criticizing and condemning those practices. Maybe the more challenging and the more interesting part is at the better end, because that's part of your story, is that it is at least conceptually possible that you could have zoos that are actually good for the animals, such that if we could, telepathically connect to the animal, genuinely and deeply understand their perspective, they would actually be happy and might even consent to be in that environment, given the other choices available to them. And that, therefore, even from the animal's perspective, is a genuinely positive position for them to be in. So I guess there's a couple of questions. One is, do you think there are any existing zoos who are actually managing to achieve that somewhat lofty goal today? Or is this more of a sort of conceptual aspiration of something that could technically be possible and you could imagine zoos one day getting there?
Yeah, I think absolutely there are zoos who do that for at least some of their species. So, any zoo holds a huge range of different animals. And so, whether or not the animals in that zoo have good lives is going to depend a lot on which species they are. But I think, and this is something we talk about in the book, there are some species which do better or worse in zoos. And so there are some which require either a lot more input or, to be left out, and some which it's not that difficult to necessarily meet their needs in captivity. And so you do see, there are a number of sort of large, I guess, well-resourced zoos that put a lot of time and attention into building huge, complex habitats for their animals that, from my point of view, I think unquestionably the animals in those lead good lives that, like you said, they would probably choose if given the choice, and that, present them in a way that is respectful and informative, that, members of the public gain something out of, that is hopefully more than just, look at those silly little animals, that they actually kind of form these, I guess, feelings of awe, feelings of compassion or empathy and connection to these animals. And that, from the animal point of view, that they have a good life, that they're happy to be there in. And so that is something I think we definitely see. I mean, I don't think even the best zoos have that across the board. I think there are probably some species in any zoo that, are having worse lives. Whether they're having terrible lives is a different question. I think for most part, outside of these, like you said, these sort of small roadside zoos, sometimes called, these under-resourced, for-profit kind of institutions that care a lot more about getting people through the door than about anything to do with their animals. Yeah, I don't think anyone inside or outside the industry denies that those are a bad thing and those should not exist. But yeah, I think certainly there's a large number of zoos across the world now that are doing a good job in providing, I guess, fulfilling lives for their animals.
Yeah.
Two things I would like to add here is that one is that, so one idea that was guiding us in writing the book is that in thinking about the welfare levels in zoos, we might think, for instance, does this particular species have a higher welfare in a zoo than in the wild? Under which case, well, you might think, oh, that's maybe then acceptable. But that might be a quite minimal standard if that wild animal actually doesn't have a good life in the wild, right? If you are ridden with disease, starvation is very common, then that might be quite a minimal condition to satisfy, but that might not satisfy any zoo critic. And we argued, actually, we probably do want more. We can do more. Zoos can actually give these animals really good lives, even if we take considerations like budgets and the like into consideration. So if a zoo is really poorly run and only runs at losses, yes, then maybe that zoo should just cease to exist because they cannot provide good lives for the animals. And the second point I wanted to make is, if you ask about how do zoos exist to do this, you probably want to distinguish between different species, because a zoo might give good lives to all species they have, except for one, say an elephant enclosure, which obviously is the case of elephants is very often discussed here and also made it onto the cover of our book, precisely because they seem like the most controversial case, where in the wild they cross many kilometers, but in these enclosures really don't have that opportunity. There we might say, look, maybe elephants, we can't say that maybe for zoos can't offer them the right conditions unless they would have really large enclosures, which typically isn't possible given where zoos are located, maybe within a city. But that's okay. We just need a more species-sensitive answer then. And that's fine to accept, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess there's a couple of sets of challenges that people will present even to a more idealized view that is put forward as being good for the animals from their perspective. One is that, we'll struggle to balance the human priorities and the animal priorities. The other one is that we may make mistakes about what is actually good for an animal in their own right. And we might do that in a self-serving way. So, and this links in a way back to our previous conversations, but how do you think about how to genuinely understand what's good and bad from the perspective of a particular animal? And how can we work that through genuinely with integrity and with humility? But I guess part of that is also philosophically, how do you think about that? Because I think you both come from a position of thinking about well-being. Others may challenge even your idealized view based on ideas about dignity and autonomy and constraint, and maybe an idea of naturalness, or maybe, a cynicism in general about human intervention that may counter, they may even object to a situation where the animal's welfare is positive. So how do you think philosophically about how can we be genuine about understanding the animal's perspective, and how do you frame that philosophically?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, it's certainly like acknowledging that this is the big challenge, this is the biggest problem in any of our dealings with animals, is how do we really take their point of view? And so, basically all my work is trying to answer this question, and how do we get at least better approximations of what it is like for these animals. But certainly, one of the things we want to emphasize, I guess, is that taking the animal's point of view seriously means thinking about what is it that those animals value? What do they have the capacity to value, for instance? And one of the things about bringing in these concepts of autonomy and dignity and naturalness is that, these seem deeply sort of anthropocentric, that, these are human-centered concepts that represent things that we value in our own lives, because we as humans have the ability to conceptualize abstract concepts and to think about these sorts of things and care a lot about them. And I guess, I have quite a strong worry that by, forcing this line that those things are good for animals, what we're really doing is we're imposing our worldview on them, that no animal is going to, face a situation of higher or lower dignity and necessarily conceptualize that there's a problem there. They're not going to, they're not going to make choices that reflect one or the other. They're not going to have positive or negative feelings towards it. And if that's not the case, why should we be sort of putting this on them, on their behalf? It starts feeling a bit kind of paternalistic, maybe. It's like, if the animals themselves don't care, and we think of caring as being reflected, in how they feel and what they choose, then sort of imposing this top down from the human point of view is perhaps not the best way to look at this. And so there might be sort of more instrumental ways of cashing out these concepts. So we talk in the book about agency, for instance. So, that reflects something like what we think of as autonomy for humans, which is the ability to make choices in your environment, to have some control over the outcomes in your life. And this is something that animals probably value, mainly because it feels good to do that. So I don't think animals can conceptualize their own agency more, we say animals in this very broad sense. Obviously, we've got a huge range of cognitive capacities, but in general, I think non-human animals don't make these conceptual distinctions. But they certainly can feel good when they are able to exercise control, and feel frustrated or, other kinds of negative experiences when they don't have this kind of control. And so that's a concern, making sure that there is the freedom to make choices and have control of their environment. So I think, yeah, we can cash these out.
And is there a second order thing about autonomy and agency? And not always, but quite often, the agent probably is best placed to take decisions that will help with their well-being in the first place. So autonomy itself generally feels good, being unconstrained to do what you want. That in itself can be a benefit, but also because you're allowed to take decisions that hopefully might actually be good for you because you're the agent who's well placed to take that decision. So I sort of think of it as almost two benefits to autonomy in that way.
No, I agree. And you get, in a sense, two poles here. One is we already see in humans that we often do not do what's best in our long-term interest. And then for animals that haven't evolved to deal with longer decision-making typically as we have done, because we've in human history had to engage in a lot of economic exchanges, longer commitments and the like, where you needed to keep track of these different values and do a kind of mental accounting, which isn't as true for animals. I have written a little bit about different animals being capable of engaging in mental time travel. You might take corvids, for instance, who sometimes cache different nuts for the future. But even then, they're not as good as really dealing with the long-term welfare necessarily. So giving animals freedom, you'd rather do it at giving animals a lot of choices because you think we don't yet know what's perhaps best for these animals. We don't have a good understanding of what their likes and dislikes are. But that's more about figuring out what's good for them in the moment rather than the long-term issue. And so certainly then we can see how giving animals choices can be good for giving them what they like in the moment, perhaps. But it might also be bad if it comes to the long-term interests. I mean, you might get zoo animals, for instance, that get obesity because they like eating certain kinds of food a lot, and then they get sick and get joint problems and the like. And so you have to, as a zookeeper, and I can tell you more about it, to think about how do you deal with this problem.
Yeah.
Yes, so I think there's this sort of, I guess the trade-off between these things where perhaps what you want to try and do is constrain the option set to those things that you think, are in the long-term interest of the animal, while then hoping within that to still have a set of choices that they can make. And, in part because, different animals like different things at different times. They say talking about like what kind of bed they have, for instance. And, people do studies on like, if we give cows, different types of flooring, so like a rubber mat or a sawdust bed or whatever. And they go, okay, well, look, they spend 60% of their time on the sawdust, so therefore we'll give them sawdust as their bedding. That kind of ignores the fact, well, they spend 40% of their time on the rubber mat. And so perhaps if you gave them both options, they could, throughout the day or night, move back and forth. Some individuals might prefer one over the other. Some might like to, in the evenings they like this, in the middle of the night they prefer this one. And so the ability to have more options available allows them to make these moment-to-moment choices. And what you can just do, I guess, is remove from that option set the things that you think are actually going to be harmful in some way in the long term, and then just leave as much variety as you can other than that.
Yeah, so you see that also in zoos, for instance, with giving animals hiding spots. You might do studies about how much time they spend in front of visitors versus in a hiding spot. And just because an animal spends more time in one area than another doesn't mean it exclusively prefers that. Many animals actually do enjoy the engagement with visitors. And I think zoo critics often have this idea that animals hate it, which can be true for some animals, of course. But what was observed during the pandemic was that many animals seemed to miss the contact with humans.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. And I think I saw an example recently where I think it was an aquarium where they actually put cardboard cutouts of people back in place during the pandemic to reassure I can't remember which variety of animal they were, but to reassure the animals that there were, people still around, which is an interesting dynamic. Yeah. And I think the idea of autonomy is a fascinating one to drill into, because I agree that some of the other sort of philosophical concepts that humans like, I'm skeptical how relevant they really are to animals, but I think autonomy is one that we'd all agree generally is important. Most non-human animals don't like being constrained in general, and that constraint is intrinsically part of the operation of a zoo. There is a constraint there. So a lot of the debate, I think, comes down to justifying that constraint. And I like the way you framed it, of talking about trying to maximize the autonomy and the choices available, but within a set that aren't harmful. So in a way, it is an idea of a maternalistic or paternalistic or benevolent intervention that imposes constraints, but in a way that hopefully has a positive trade-off from the perspective of the being that's being constrained. And there's a couple of interesting comparators that maybe, some might say these comparators aren't really relevant, because all that matters is, how did the animal feel about their and their family's life, and is that a positive thing for them? So you don't need a comparator. But there are some interesting comparators, and one you've touched on already, which is their life in the wild. Now, in the situation where an animal is rescued from the wild, I think that comparator works, because you are taking them from one situation and putting them in another, and arguably if that situation is better in a zoo or a sanctuary, then there is at least a justification there. It may still not be optimal, it may still not be positive, but at least it is a positive shift for that animal. I think that comparator is much less relevant when you're talking about animals that are bred within zoo environments, because they're not being rescued from anywhere. So in the same way as sometimes people will justify animal agriculture by saying, well, we're saving them from a worse existence in the wild. At least we're feeding them and keeping them warm and happy before we kill them. You've got to be very careful about these comparators. But there's also that comparator with animal agriculture itself. So animal sanctuaries and rescue sanctuaries will say, well, the life of this rescue pig might not be absolutely perfect, and they are constrained, but they seem to be having a happy life. And we did rescue them from animal agriculture, which was brutal and torturous and deadly as well. So how do you think about those sorts of comparators when you're evaluating the possibility of a good zoo, whether it's comparing against the wild or comparing against other scenarios of human-animal interaction?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult problem. And I mean, there's a sort of a problem in philosophy. It's called the non-identity problem, which is essentially about how do you compare two different outcomes where in one of the outcomes the individual wouldn't even exist, and then in the other outcome they have some particular level of well-being. It's like, well, how do you compare if their life is improved or not by having outcome one versus outcome two? And so this is sort of the situation with most zoo animals. Like you said, very few of them are taken from the wild. Most of them are bred in captivity. And so it doesn't make any sense to say, well, had they not been in this zoo, they would have had a life in the wild. No, they wouldn't. They would have had no life. They would have not existed. And so, in some sense, you might then go, well, okay, their life just has to be better than not existing. But that can be a very difficult thing to cash out, because what is the welfare value of not existing? Maybe it's the same as like a neutral zero line of well-being. It's neither pleasure nor pain. It's just, so I mean, even if you think that, maybe that's a very low bar. It's like, oh, you just have to be this far above a life of just zero, so just this kind of very medium existence where nothing's really good and nothing's really bad. That doesn't really seem like a good enough justification. It's not a life that we would want for ourselves. And so this question of, what's a life worth living and a life that sort of justifies this is a difficult one even for humans. So, people who worry about human populations. And I don't think we have good answers for it in the animal case either at the moment. There's a lot of talk about what are these thresholds and how do we say, how good does an animal life have to be before we can say it's good enough for what we're doing here? So, I mean, that's, I think, a difficult question without really a good answer. Like we said, we probably want it to be somewhere above just this zero line of like, okay, it wants to be flourishing in some sort of sense, but you don't want to set it too high. It's saying like, well, it has to be a beautiful life full of nothing but joy. Most humans don't even have that. It seems crazy to think that animals in zoos have it. And certainly, like you said, when we compare to other sorts of situations that animals are kept in, zoo animals are probably one of the best off groups, compared to agricultural animals. And even perhaps much more controversially, I'd say, compared to pet animals. A lot of pet animals people keep in their houses, so companion animals, in their backyards. They spend a lot of their day alone, without much to do. They often have very little control over their environments. An apartment dog, for instance, doesn't even get to choose when it goes to the toilet. So there's all kinds of things that, companion animals lack that zoo animals, the keepers, spend a lot of time trying to make sure they have. And so when people criticize zoos, yeah, it seems to be holding these to a very high standard compared to what you'd expect for almost all other forms of animal use.
Yeah. And another interesting comparator for me is the idea of an animal sanctuary, because there's something about the way an animal sanctuary is described that makes it feel more positive in the eyes and minds of many in the animal movement, for example, largely because they are playing a role of saving or rescuing a non-human animal from a position of human exploitation and bringing them into an environment where they're safe and looked after and hopefully happy. So it's partly because it's being brought from an exploitative situation that it's seen as positive. But obviously, many sanctuaries also do look after wild animals that have suffered in the wild or maybe injured or ill or abandoned. So the framing is much more clearly, they're there for the animals. That's the main point of sanctuaries. But of course, there's an enormous variety of sanctuaries too. So there are many sanctuaries which actually have pretty poor conditions, and many sanctuaries where actually the human motivations have actually undermined the motivation to center around the animals' needs as well. So there's a danger in being oversimplified about, what a sanctuary does and is and how that is for the animals. But at the same time, there are also parallels. So you have a variety of different sanctuaries, you have a variety of different zoos. Both do, by their very nature, constrain the non-human animals. So how do you think about the idea of a sanctuary or the reality of a sanctuary compared to the idea of a zoo? Because one simplistic idea would be, could we rename zoos as sanctuaries, and would that help us shift the focus in the way you're suggesting to really genuinely center the best interests of the animals? So what do you think about that comparison? And is that a shift you'd think is valid, or is there something distinctive about zoos that sets them apart validly from a good sanctuary?
I'll just say a short thing before I give to Hedda. I think you raised a very interesting point about how things are named. So the word sanctuary almost implies a kind of nice glow around it, right? You think, these must be great for the animals. But then you might not question as much how the animals are being treated there, versus the word zoo, which at least to critics often implies a kind of, look, the animals are more used at least for entertainment purposes, so there may be exploitation or not. That implies something very negative to a lot of people, which is why so many zoos now are changing their names towards, say, conservation parks or the like, because they want to avoid the negativity associated with the label, perhaps. Or the idea that zoological parks are only interested in featuring a wide diversity of species, maybe doing research. But look, no, we're not just doing that and entertaining visitors, but we're also engaged in conservation efforts. And so names actually do play a surprisingly large role, and branding issues are important here.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly one of the worries is there's no regulations around who gets to use the word sanctuary and who doesn't. And so, there are institutions that call themselves sanctuaries that really just breed a lot of young animals for visitors to come and pat for photos. So, there's this huge range. But if we take sanctuary seriously as, these institutions that kind of have the primary goal of rescuing animals and putting their resources towards housing them well until the ends of their lives, I think they are differentiated from zoos in that zoos are public institutions that, exist for people to come and learn or connect and interact with animals in certain kinds of ways. And many sanctuaries are close to the public. They don't do this. And so, I think that's probably one of the biggest differences is, where that focus lies. But certainly that doesn't have to imply a difference in quality in life in the way that I think the word sanctuary, like Walter said, has this kind of glow about it, that people just assume that in a sanctuary you must do well and in a zoo you must do worse. But the resource constraints of a lot of sanctuaries are very real. They typically rely on charitable funding, whereas zoos have, the money that comes in through the gate and from various other kinds of funds like that. And so the ability to provide well for animals is potentially there for zoos. And so, there's this huge range. Some sanctuaries do very well, some do worse. some have very lofty goals, but it can also make a difference on the way that you manage animals. So I was reading a research paper recently about one of the first whale sanctuaries. There's been a lot of issues at the moment about cetaceans in captivity. And so there was a sanctuary that was opened up to try and shift pilot whales out of aquarium settings into the sanctuary. And essentially, looking at what's actually happened, they've had these 2 pilot whales there and they have a big coastal yard. They've essentially, the whales had almost no time within the big external part of the sanctuary because of various health issues and having to condition them. They've spent the years that they've been there in an indoor pool, basically the same as what they would have been in the aquarium. And so even when you try, there may be constraints that just mean you can't realize, as much as you wanted to for the animals.
Yeah, thank you. It's tough, isn't it? But I agree that, we shouldn't be distracted by the terms and the names we use too much. Again, you're trying to come back to this, what is it like for the animals? What's best for them, whether they're in a sanctuary or some other environment. Thank you. One of the things I thought might be interesting to do would be this is almost a dangerous question to ask, but if we're in a position where we reject speciesism while recognizing the differences of interests and capacities and of different beings, are there analogies with intrahuman situations where you can imagine similar philosophical motivations, where we're helping or we're saving or we're applying benevolent intervention or maternalism or paternalism that could help people see that there's something consistent here? Because one of the other challenges to the very idea of a zoo would be along those lines of, an anti-speciesist stance, which says, look, there's no situation in which we would ever consider doing this with our fellow humans. There's plenty of horrific examples over, history where many Homo sapiens have actually been in some of these menageries themselves. So that's another part of the emotional and philosophical challenge, even to your positive vision of zoos. I don't know if there's something productive in, how would you respond to those sorts of challenges?
I think there are groups of humans for which we do have similar kinds of things. And I guess you tread very carefully through here because people get worried that, if you draw analogies that you're saying that these humans are animal-like or something, but of course that itself is kind of speciesist because, well, there's something wrong with that. But if we think of, human beings who perhaps don't have the kind of the high cognitive functioning to make the sorts of rational, autonomous decisions for their lives that we consider typical adult humans to be able to do, we certainly put all kinds of, I guess, constraints and protections in place in a caring way. And so,
including children, I guess.
Raising children, that's a huge part of it. Like, if we think that raising children, we don't let them go wherever they want, whenever they want, and do whatever they want. They're typically constrained to the spaces in which their parents allow them to go, and they are fed what their parents want them to eat, and all these sorts of things. They do have this sort of constraint for their own good, and the idea is, if you do it well, that you give them the choices again within the option set that you think is sort of safe and valuable for them to choose between. But they don't have those sorts of freedoms. And when we think of, I guess, care facilities as well for people of different sorts of, I guess, cognitive disabilities and these sorts of things, again, you have the same things. If you think that perhaps people are not in a situation to make these decisions for themselves, you create caring but restricted environments where in best practice, you are thinking about what is good for them and providing all the things that you hope that they need to have a good life. But that freedom is restricted for what is taken to be their own good. So I think, we do think in this kind of, I guess in this sort of caring paradigm that sometimes to show care for another human being is to protect them in certain kinds of ways and is to constrain their freedoms in ways that you think make them better off.
Mm. And another thing is, one argument sometimes used by critics of zoos is that some zoos in history actually featured humans to, say, show hierarchies of dominations between maybe the white race and other races, and that was all horrific. And so if that's the case for humans, why wouldn't we think the same can be the case for animals? And it might be. I don't think it's quite the same, because if you think of most people who go to zoos or people operating zoos, they're not trying to show how much better humans are versus animals. They're typically animal lovers, and they want to take care of them, and I appreciate them, wanting to look at them. So there's the difference is quite major. But we can clearly say for many enclosures, say of orangutans, who sometimes have very small enclosures, the small groups, individuals might get separated, who can get lonely, that's actually often a very sad life, and their life in the wild might be much better. And of course, sometimes their natural habitats just get destroyed, so zoos sometimes become like sanctuaries here. Where else would they otherwise be? And we really want to think much more about how do you give animals social opportunities. And there often keepers actually start to play crucial roles. They're not just someone who looks after the animals, but they're really a close social companion, right?
Yeah. Thank you. There's some really important lessons there because, as you say, even within intrahuman ethics, we don't see autonomy and non-intervention as incontrovertible principles we must uphold, right? If we see humans subject to a natural disaster, we don't say, well, hands off, we must not intervene under any circumstances. And as you say, if an individual might use their autonomy in a way that would harm themselves, we're quite comfortable with various forms of hopefully well-motivated benevolent intervention as well. So I think that you can consistently carry those principles across, always being self-aware that, we're very good at using these types of arguments to justify things we wanted to do anyway. But I think there are genuinely consistent arguments there. So that's
you
helpful.
could see this, for instance, in politics, where look, you might say, well, let's just give people their autonomy. And we don't want to. The non-identity problem came up before, and I think typically it's used in a bad way to highlight how much more we should emphasize harms and benefits, when really what matters is are individuals doing well or poorly. Otherwise, you might say, well, taking away some money from maybe the rich to give money to the poor, well, that's harming the rich. So clearly we can't do that because that would be a violation. And so maybe we should just think more on balance of how can we increase general welfare. And clearly we would say, look, just not interfering with people's lives, say homeless people, it doesn't really give them that much freedom. So in political philosophy, sometimes you distinguish between negative freedom and positive freedom. And maybe it's the wrong word to use because no one's necessarily interfering when it comes to positive freedoms. The freedom you have to do certain things. No one's stopping you from it. You might just not have the resources or abilities to. But typically we want to give people opportunities. And in the same way, a zoo can give animals opportunities. So they might not have, say, that negative freedom of being able to leave their enclosures, but they might have much more free time to engage in the activities they really care about. So instead of spending most of the hours in a day, say, hiding from predator animals, being very aware of that, spending a lot of mental resources on that, as well as spending a lot of resource time on finding food, that's actually quite easy. Comes at a certain time, they're already getting excited in the hour before that. And then they can really spend the rest of the time how they want. So zoo animals actually are, in a sense, much more free time. They have free time just as human children might after they've done their homeworks and so forth. They can play, and the same is true for animals.
Yeah, so there's so many fascinating trade-offs there. And like you say, I think they do apply through into the human world as well, right? We will and we voluntarily trade off some autonomy and freedom for security. And there's a good argument that the sort of freedoms we want depend on certain resources and security and enablement from other things. It's not just being an isolated being, out there alone doing what you want to do. That's not necessarily the best possible life. So yeah, thank you. One thing I thought might be quite interesting would be to talk through, if you like, the life history of an animal in a zoo and talk through some of the different stages, because there are opportunities and challenges at each of those stages. And I was thinking of particular points including breeding practices, including feeding practices, including many of the things you talked about already, which is sort of general day-to-day life and family groups and social groups, and then ultimately, death in its various forms as well. So I don't know if it's worth spending a few minutes on sort of each of those stages, so you could point out some of the risks and challenges, but also your vision for how you would like these things to be handled in the sort of good zoo that you're imagining. So I don't know if the breeding part is a interesting place to start, because even there you have a variety of different interests. From the animal's perspective, breeding is part of their natural behavior and something that many animals would want to do. Of course, by allowing that, you're then bringing in new life into being within the zoo, which you talked about before. But then the human motivations around conservation may also have an influence on breeding practices, whether it's allowed or directed. So how do you think about the sort of breeding question in the zoo context positively?
Yeah, so I think the breeding question is probably one of the most ethically difficult issues that zoos are facing at the moment. And that's because of the problem of what are called surplus animals. And so these are essentially animals that zoos don't necessarily have space or resources to house. And there is this enormous trade-off between, so, there are benefits certainly to performing breeding behavior. If we think about the range of natural behaviors any animal has available to it, reproductive behaviors, so forming bonds with other animals, going through mating behaviors, and then giving birth to and rearing young are just a huge part of that, and usually very positivity valence. They're sources of a lot of reward for these animals as well. And so allowing animals to do these things is almost certainly enriching their lives in most cases. And, it depends on the species. Mammals in particular, that is a much larger part of their life than it's going to be for, say, a reptile. So, it varies. But yeah, thinking about, say, your typical mammal, which is what people think about often when they think about zoo animals, that is going to be something important in their lives. And so there's this positive argument for allowing animals to do that. But if you allow them to do so unconstrained, you end up with a lot of offspring. They survive at a much higher rate than they would in the wild, and you end up with a lot of adult animals, and they take space and they take time and they take money. And, at some point, whatever it's going to be, you're going to reach your maximum capacity to do that. Resources are always finite. And so in some zoos, what they will do is they will euthanize the offspring, usually around the age that they would disperse from their parents naturally in the wild. So the idea is, they're no longer dependent on their parents. From the parents' point of view, that animal leaving them is not a source of major grief, because that would be what would happen in the wild. They would leave. And the argument is that the humane euthanasia of the animal essentially causes it no pain or suffering. It's just taken away, quietly put to sleep, and does not continue to exist. And so some people say, well, given the benefits of breeding and sort of the lack of harm, then that is fine. That's a nice way to keep a healthy, flourishing population. It also allows you to keep the genetics fresh, because you're breeding animals. You can keep the ones that have the genetics that keep the population going and euthanize the ones that don't. But other people are very concerned about this, because obviously it involves the loss of life of animals who would otherwise have had potentially good lives. And so, managing this is really, really difficult. And certainly the idea that euthanasia is not a harm, I think, is a dangerous one, because it implies that the only thing bad in your life is experiencing suffering. But, I think the length of life matters too. If you think about the lifetime well-being, even if all you think about is the feelings of pleasure and suffering, if you end that life prematurely, you just have fewer experiences, fewer good things happen to you. And so, you think that this is going to be a harm as well. And so, I don't have here a prescription for what the right thing to do is, because it is just trading off these different things that, on the one hand, you can restrict animals from breeding, and that gives them fewer opportunities. On the other hand, you euthanize some animals. And so I think, there's just a careful middle ground to tread there, which is trying to plan your breeding such that animals get some opportunities to do these things, whilst hopefully maintaining a population size that isn't beyond your capacity to care for. And this involves perhaps, keeping large bachelor groups of animals when you get too many males of certain species, or, having something more like sanctuaries, open range kind of areas that can keep larger numbers of animals of these kind of surplus that perhaps can't be kept in, city zoo on display enclosures or something. But yeah, it means it's very species specific. It requires a lot of really careful decision making, but is perhaps one of the most ethically fraught areas of zoo management.
Yeah, it's tough. And I agree. And another interesting thought experiment, which we quite often do, is jump across into the human space. And as you say, if even painless killing against someone's interests or will isn't a bad thing to do. There's quite a few people who are currently in prison who we should let out because they're there for murder, right? And some of them were done painlessly. So there's an interesting thought experiment there. But I'm with you that I do see killing when it's not done for the best interests of the being killed. That's an intrinsic wrong for a variety of reasons as well. So yeah, it's a tough space. The next question is about feeding of animals. And I guess one of the really interesting and challenging questions here is about carnivorous animals. Now, I think it's probably technically true that even carnivorous animals don't really need to eat meat if they get the right technical nutrients from the right places. There might be other solutions, technically or otherwise. And you can see that in the companion animal space because there are now commercially available, completely 100% plant-based foods available for dogs and cats, for example, and cats are obligate carnivores. So as long as you get the taurine and the spirulina and the other things that can be synthesized, fine. So we can put that to one side. But generally, carnivorous animals are fed the bodies of other animals. So in that sense, in a zoo context, if you're allowing the breeding of more carnivores, you are also taking the decision to, harm, exploit, and kill tens, if not hundreds, of other sentient beings. So how do you think about carnivorous animals in a zoo context? Is that something that could ever be done in your ethical model of a zoo?
Well, I mean, we do already have lab-grown meat at this point. Once that is on scale and affordable, we could just supply carnivorous animals in zoos with lab-grown, clean meat, ethical meat without any problem necessarily. I mean, until then, still a complex ethical question, of course. You might want to say, look, maybe we should just have zoos for animals that do not rely on killing other animals. And that might be a fair point to make. And you might think, well, predator animals are often more endangered in the wild because of trophy hunting, for instance. And clearly that's a difficult ethical cost. Some moral philosophers have argued maybe we should sterilize all the predators in the wild. And that's quite a radical view.
Herbivorizing nature, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some tough questions there. But it does seem that, one of the other themes you've talked through today and in the book is being very conscious about which types of animal species it makes sense to even consider being in a zoo. And I think, carnivores are one that looks tough. Elephants, you explained, there are another as well. And as we think more broadly about the day-to-day life, social groups, families, and so on, I guess that's the central point, is being very sensitive to the needs and interests and perspectives of the particular species. Are there any other groups of animals that you think are just not suited to even your idealized zoo that you'd call out as other examples of the sorts of considerations we need to take seriously?
I mean, I guess in theory, there is no such animal in that, given enough space and enough resources, it's probably possible to give any animal a good life in captivity. But when you talk about the realistic constraints on resources that we have, then yeah, I think there are going to be species. And certainly, there has been research done looking at how we make these decisions, looking at, which are the animals that are most often associated with poor welfare outcomes in captivity, and what are the characteristics that they share. And one of those characteristics is being a wide-ranging carnivore animal. So, having an animal that is a carnivorous diet and typically has a very, very large area that it makes its way through. And so perhaps those species are not good for captivity, but then some of the follow-up research is trying to identify, what exactly it is about being that kind of animal, because perhaps then you can just come up with ways of keeping them. Is it because they need to see a novel scene every so often and, maybe you can just make changes to their enclosure? Is it because they physically need to walk 20 kilometers a day in order to be happy? Like, which of these things is it that's the problem? And then, are there ways of making this happen within a captive environment? So I think, from those points of view, perhaps there are ways of doing it. I'd say for me right now, certainly large cetaceans are the problem. So whales in particular. And I think, when I think about the way that orcas are typically kept in captivity, so if I think of what an equivalent large carnivorous mammal looks like, so thinking maybe like a polar bear or something that, approaches the sort of size and lifestyle of the polar bears are solitary and orcas are very social. When you think about what kind of enclosure we create, an environment we create for a polar bear, and when the size and the complexity of it and the variety they get offered, and then when you think of what a typical enclosure for any kind of orca looks like, the size and the lack of complexity, there's just, a completely different standard being held to there. And so, again, I think, it's not impossible to have something that was large enough and complex enough with, the number of orcas that you require to get like a natural kind of pod structure. But I think the resources that would actually require to do in captivity just makes it probably prohibitive. And so, I think that's a species that right now is not being kept as well as it should be, and quite possibly won't be able to be.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess there's that link between the capacities and the interests of the particular animal, but also as you say, the resources and the space that any particular zoo might have. If there's a city zoo versus another place that has thousands of acres, there are different potential matches there that may or may not work. So
and I mean, one thing that came up earlier was elephants, and certainly I think elephants in city zoos typically is not a good idea, but you're seeing at the moment this movement where very large numbers of city zoos are relocating their animals to sort of countryside zoos. So, there are a lot of sort of more like rural safari park style areas that have very, very large spaces that people tour, sometimes in buses or cars or various things that just, focus on having usually large ungulates of different kinds, giraffes and antelopes and zebras and elephants. And we're seeing in Australia, for instance, basically all the city zoo animals are being relocated out to these countryside habitats where they can just be given much, much more space and being kept in larger, more natural groupings. And so this is an example of how you can take a welfare problem with a species and fix it without actually having to get rid of that animal in captivity. It's just thinking about, okay, not every zoo can just keep, the same list of 10 animals. City zoos might want to focus on the diversity of like small, complex animals, and then these sort of open range zoos focus on the large ungulates or something like that. And so thinking about this division of labor and different zoos being specializing more in what they can keep well, I think is certainly a nice way forwards.
Yeah, thank you.
And you might also, typically people just think here of the large animals, but when we go and see, say, a reptile house with snakes and the like, often enclosures, they are quite small. It always reminds me that snakes might just want to stretch the whole body out, which some research has shown, but becomes impossible in some of these enclosures. So our recommendations aren't just about, yes, okay, there's some very large animals like elephants, orcas. No, animals that are very small are often given the least attention in terms of welfare. And to some extent, you might think we might have a more radical shift here, or what becomes necessary. Perhaps you'd want those enclosures to be way larger, making it even more difficult for people to sometimes spot the snake in that enclosure.
Yeah.
Birds are a good example here actually as well. So, birds obviously, they fly, and so the three-dimensional space they have access to becomes very, very important. And traditionally, you do see a lot of zoos that just have these big rows of like bird, all quite small and not allowing them much space to fly. But I think increasingly you see now large, open range, multi-species walk-in aviary spaces where the birds can move around a lot more. They usually have a lot more opportunities. Again, they might be a little bit more difficult to see, but usually if you stand quietly, there's something kind of the excitement of bird spotting that you can wait and see which species that you look for. And these don't come without their problems. There are certain kinds of stresses that birds experience in these multi-species spaces, and perhaps, competition over certain resources if you don't build in everything in the right kind of way. But I think it's a step in the right direction to think about, these sort of previously overlooked animals and how can you give them space to have, what they need as well.
Yeah, thank you. So for every species and even in every individual, there's a deep thought and potentially some quite radical changes required to really make that environment work well for them from their perspective. Thank you. So I guess to bring the conversation full circle, because I should probably let you go soon, many people will still, big picture, think about the nature of human interactions with non-human animals, and generally, and with good reason, are so horrified by the nature of those relationships, whether it's in animal farming and fishing and exploitation and elsewhere, that their prescription is essentially humans just hands off, get out of the way. The best thing we can do for animals is minimal intervention, minimal engagement, just not help at all. And I can understand emotionally the pull of that, because we see our track record as humanity with regard to wider sentientity is egregious, right? So I feel that pull. But I think the story you're telling, whether people agree or not, is trying to say, well, okay, we understand that reaction to human harms, but actually, if we genuinely try to take the perspectives of the animals themselves as sentient beings, that doesn't necessarily lead us to a position where there is zero human engagement, zero human intervention, when it's genuinely benevolent. And we talked about that a little bit in our previous conversations when we're talking about intervention in the wild or free-ranging animals as well. There's a similar dynamic there where if our cynicism about humanity leads us to hold back from even helping when we obviously can, maybe we're making a mistake there. And in a way, the story you're telling with the zoos is analogous to that. There is actually a positive potential for these institutions and our relations as well. But it is based on an assumption that we can do what you've suggested in your book, which is put the best interests of the animals as the absolutely central pillar. And how do you think we can actually carry that through practically? Because one, us humans are quite good at, getting non-human animal interests wrong, often in our own interests. And others will say, well, it's great we put animals as the central pillar, but as long as the other pillars are still there, the other human interests in conservation and research and education and entertainment, as long as they are still acknowledged, we know what us humans are like, and those other pillars will strangely, overwhelm the animal interests again. So how do we get from this sort of theory of a institution of zoos, which are genuinely, deeply, with integrity, actually good for the non-human animals, such that if they spoke to us, they would say, this is great, I'm happy, and this is what I want. How do we make that link from the theory not get dragged into a more insidious exploitative practice? And an analogy which is probably unfair might be with the way animal agriculture presents themselves as, humane and sustainable, and we care about our animals as a means for justifying what us humans want to carry on doing. A big question, but is that theory into practice?
Yeah, no, I think you're right that it's a huge and difficult issue. I mean, perhaps zoos have one advantage in this regard compared to sort of other forms of animal use, in that their business model is essentially bringing humans and animals together. The whole point is to bring humans through the door. Like, obviously, yes, they're a business, they're making money, they're trying to bring people in. But the ways in which they bring people in, if we think, perhaps optimistically, but I hope that we're seeing in society, people are recognizing, animals as other subjects, they're recognizing their sentience, and they're caring about them. And I think we see an increased concern for animal welfare as a general trend, even if, there are specific declines in areas. So if we think that's true, we think people care a lot about animal welfare, then it actually makes business sense for zoos to do well for animals as well, because that is what people want when they go there. And so, if we think one of the things we did in the book was we talked about this kind of pillar of entertainment and about reconceiving that pillar as the pillar of connection between humans and animals. Because that's what I see when I work in zoos and when I go there now, is that people who go there, they don't just want to see animals, they want to connect to them. Like, people absolutely love the animal looking back at them, or, if it comes over to the window and follows them, or whatever it is. Like, these sorts of things make someone stay. These are the things they remember for years to come. And the rise in popularity of certain kinds of animal encounters where you can go along with the keepers and feed or interact with the animal in some way. People pay a lot of money to do these things. And you can see like the wonder that they feel when this happens, when they get close to animals. And so I guess, my hope, perhaps my naive optimism, is that humans genuinely have a kind of a psychological desire to do well by animals and to connect with them. And this misfires in all sorts of ways. But if we are very explicit about the fact that we want zoos to care about animal welfare above all other things, and, anytime a decision-making scenario comes up where you might have a conflict between, well, like, this will be worse for animal welfare, but it does help us bring in more visitors, or it helps us, do better for conservation. If you've kind of got it explicitly laid out that no, in those situations, the animal welfare will always come up on top, or has to come out on top on those trade-offs. The hope is that people can remember to bring that up in their decision-making, but the hope is also that these conflicts don't come up as often if we kind of recognize people's desire to give animals good lives and to connect with them in a way that sort of is positive for both.
Thank you. So there can be something genuinely mutual there, and that the fascination people feel with non-human animals is not just a sort of aesthetic fascination. It is also because of that compassionate, empathic link, and, as you say, recognizing there's another sentient being there looking back at you. So, and I agree. I have this sort of naive sense that, at least deep down, under the social norms and all the other, institutional forces, the vast majority of humans do genuinely feel that compassion for non-human animals when you look into each other's eyes. So there's something there about tapping into that and enhancing it that could be a positive value. Thank you.
Yeah, that's quite important about the existence of zoos, especially in cities. So one of the bad things about them moving away to be perhaps 1 hour drive or so away from a city, that can be quite negative to some extent if then city people who might never see animals in the wild, except for birds flying around, perhaps the occasional rat on the street, don't have that engagement, which can actually make people more caring about animals, right? So yes, people who go to zoos typically already care more about animals. But then if you have something like a school trip to the zoo where a kid for the first time sees all these animals, and that can often lead to someone becoming much more of a animal activist, or at least someone who cares about animals. And that can't be taken for granted. I mean, yes, humans tend to care about others, but we do not tend to care about others if we've never encountered them, right? And so having some encounters is, I think, quite important for humans to care more about animals. And zoos are one of the only places where that actually happens.
Mm. And is there, the idea of, taking the entertainment angle and making it into something more ethical and more moral, actually about a connection and a sense of compassion, I think is compelling. And is there also something you would change about the education pillar of zoos? Because there is a sense, I haven't been to a zoo for a long, long while, but from my memory of them, my impression of them is the education does seem to be quite focused on external behaviors and environments and interactions. It can almost feel quite technical. Is there something in the education pillar that can refer more strongly and directly to what it might be like to be these animals? Is there some shift there that we might be able to push?
Yeah, so certainly I think we do see the education role of zoos shifting already. There was this idea that originally you just have these little kind of like signs at every enclosure. It's just like species name, distribution, behaviors, whatever. And I mean, if you go to sort of like the larger, more well-resourced zoos now, and they have just huge displays of interactive activities for people to participate in. Are you as tall as this animal? Listen to this, feel these things. A lot of it's conservation focus. It's about behavior change that you can do to help the animals that you meet. And so I think, yeah, there is this idea to try and connect people more in this way. One thing I really like seeing when I go to zoos is when they have little signs about all the individual animals in an enclosure, for instance. So instead of just going and you're seeing a bunch of penguins, it's like, oh, well, this is this penguin. And they usually, a little bit about their personality. He's a cheeky one. He likes to do this. And this is his partner. And they've raised 2 chicks together. And, so you can sort of go there and you go, okay, I see the one with the red tag on its wing. That's that guy. And yeah, you start getting a sense of them as individuals, as subjects who have personalities and preferences and likes and dislikes.
Yeah. So it's he, she, and they, not it. And it's individuals and names. And yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's probably a really strong way of, giving people this idea that they're interacting there with other subjects and not just sort of, viewing something flat in the world there.
Yeah, thank you. Now, in our normal conversations, we finish up by talking about how can we make a better world. Are there things you can suggest people do to try and push things in this direction, and influence existing zoos to improve radically? Or I know your book isn't really a sort of campaign activism book, but are there things you can suggest that people might want to explore?
So I think one of the things is to be careful about which zoos you support. So, we talked a bit before about the difference between, what's brought up, the accredited versus non-accredited zoos, for instance. And certainly accreditation is not a perfect process. It doesn't mean that, a zoo's great, but it's a step forwards. It means that a zoo's making an effort to be part of a governing body which has welfare as at least one of its focuses. And so, avoiding, I guess, giving money and supporting in any way these smaller, poorly run zoos that give you the opportunities to perhaps get up close with animals without respecting those animals' choices in those encounters. So being very, very careful about what you support with your money and time and attention, what you share on social media as well. So I think there is this rise of people who have, certain kinds of interactions with animals. It looks very cute, sort of like and reshare. And in many cases, those animals are not kept well. And so, again, boosting the signal of zoos that are doing a good job and just not supporting with your time, attention, or money those that aren't.
Yeah, thank you. Cool. Well, I should let you go, but it's been yet another fascinating conversation. So thank you so much. What's the best way people, obviously buying the book and exploring these themes in more depth, but also just following your work more generally, social media and your academic stuff too? Heather, I don't know if you want to go first. Where would you point people?
So I guess I have my website, which is heatherbrowning.net, and also my Blue Sky. I've sort of post a lot about my work there and about other animal welfare issues that I find interesting. So I think those are the best ways to follow what's going on.
Brilliant. Thank you. And how about you, Walter?
Yeah, walterwhite.com, and anything that comes up on first page on Google, you can follow me there.
Sounds great. Yeah. And of course, the book is available in all good bookshops and probably some bad ones too.
That's right. Online retailers. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a fascinating, thoughtful read, and one where, many people will agree on some fronts and disagree on others, but it is a genuine attempt to try and reposition zoos, something that could actually be good for the animals within them. So whether people agree or not, hopefully they'll see that your motivation is genuine and deep, and it's a really thoughtful, interesting contribution to quite a difficult topic. So thank you so much for writing it.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for being a guest on Sentientism again. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
No, it's been fun.
Cool. Well, please do stay in touch, and I'll speak to you very soon.
Thank you.